How safe do you think your password is? Most people tend to prefer really short ones, like about 4 to 8 digits. But these days, web apps and mobile applications are pushing for more complex passwords, so we're stuck with these hard-to-remember combinations of about 8 to 12 characters, mixing uppercase letters, lowercase letters, numbers, and special characters. We're forced into using these tough passwords because of those nasty hackers. Yep, it's all because of brute force attacks, a hacking technique. Encryption itself is a pretty simple technique if you exclude all the complex math and stuff needed to implement it, of course. When we pick a password, we scramble it up with weird characters so it's not recognizable, then store it in databases and such. There are various methods to make it unrecognizable, like using MD5 or SHA-1. These are basically math formulas, so most of them share similar features, but the key is there's no reverse formula. For example, if your password is 31337, you could just multiply it by 23 and add 8080, and you'd get a super long number. But if those sneaky hackers figure out that you just multiplied by 23 and added 8080, then boom! Millions of people's personal info could be compromised. That's why we need formulas that can't be reversed, called one-way encryption techniques. But those bad hackers aren't ones to give up easily, so they resort to simple and brute methods to neutralize them. They just take a wild guess at what kind of password someone might use. It's a ridiculous method, but surprisingly effective. Why? Well, it's simple. They collect a massive amount of passwords that people commonly use and try them one by one. In hacking tools, they call this a dictionary or a word list. In essence, it's like big data of passwords that people commonly use. This is practically the engine of password cracking tools. Another thing they use is encryption algorithms, the one-way encryption methods I mentioned earlier. For instance, they might use the most commonly used words by a specific age group over the last 10 years, or passwords commonly used by people from a specific country, or combinations of personal information. It's scary to think about, but there's a plethora of leaked passwords from real hacking incidents floating around the internet. And on top of that, there are plenty of password cracking tools that are easy to get and easy to use. People tend to stick with the passwords they've been using since they were kids, and they want to put easy-to-remember info in their everyday passwords. Plus, if a password is too long, it's a pain to type in during emergencies or moments of panic. Since people tend to think alike, if you start trying hundreds of passwords, you'll likely crack most of them. The typical starting point for most hacker attacks is to somehow find out a user's account from an email address or messenger ID, then try to log in with that account. If they're trying to log in remotely, they'll use hacking tools like Medusa or Hydra to guess passwords indiscriminately and keep trying to log in. Let's take a peek at how they do it.
Information was obtained that the administrator's ID of the database was Hyde. Then, we can now try to find out the password with an encryption cracking tool called Medusa. We need something called Crunch. This tool allows us to store words in a file that can generate numerous passwords. Words are stored in this file. If we check the contents of the file, the words are saved like this. Number combination. In addition, there are several other combinations, such as numbers and letter combinations, upper and lowercase letters, and special characters. Now, let's actually make a combination of words. Since we get information that database managers like to create passwords with combinations of numbers, we will create word files with numbers only. Set the length of the passwords to be created. We can make at least 7 letters to up to 7 letters. It is a file that writes down how to generate passwords. This is the file we saw earlier, meaning that a password will be created only with a combination of numbers. The generated passwords are stored in this file. Now the created passwords must have been saved in the file. We can see the file. Let's check the password stored in the file. We will now attack the actual database with the created password file. The database server to attack. The administrator ID of the database that we already found out. The passwords to use for the attack. MySQL database is the target of attack. I think the attack is over. It's quite fast. Of course, it is because it consists of only 7 digits. It can take a lot longer in the event of an actual attack. It's the password of the manager. We can see the administrator's account. Let's log on as an administrator. Log in successful. Let's take a look at what information there is. It is like a table with information on game items. We can see the information we saw on the website. It is like a table in which login information is stored. The information of 2 members. However, the password appears to be encrypted. Now all we have to do is crack those passwords.
However, in such cases, generating a large volume of connection packets within a short period makes it not too difficult for server administrators or security managers to detect. Alternatively, attackers might employ smarter tactics, intermittently and randomly attempting brute force attacks over a long period. Even in these cases, the tools used by attackers leave fingerprints on the packets they send, which can be filtered out by firewall filters or IDS. If a sophisticated hacking tool like SQL Map has already stolen a large amount of personal information, the next step would naturally be to crack the encrypted passwords of accounts. This is where tools like Hashcat come into play for cracking. Let me show you how it's done.
We will crack this encrypted password to find out the original letters. I will store the encrypted password I saw earlier in a file called mypwd. I'm going to decrypt it with a tool called Hashcat. We will use the brute force technique, which randomly creates and substitutes strings. How is the password encrypted? Let Hashcat know. The place where the password needs to be decrypted. How many letters is the password? What I guessed. It could be numbers or special characters. It may be uppercase or lowercase. Decryption start. But I think there's a problem. There seems to be some previously used file. Apparently, there's something called pot file. I think so. Then, where is this? It's in the home directory. Let's erase this. Now, let's start decrypting again. It shows in detail the situation in which the code is being decrypted. It also tells you the estimated time, the number of letters you'll find out after decryption, the time it took to decipher so far, estimated time left. It means that it's still being decrypted. Oh, I think the password decryption is over. Of course, it's because it's a password made with a short number of characters. This is the password. Let's log in now.
In such cases, since the information has already been stolen, there's no choice but to rely on the strength of the passwords. Therefore, during the time it takes to detect a security breach and notify users, we can only hope that the passwords we've created will withstand the attack. If a password is cracked, it's ultimately the fault of the user for not following security recommendations from the start. Now, let's see what happens when we actually create a secure password. Let's follow the common recommendation we often see during sign-up. A password should include uppercase letters, lowercase letters, numbers, special characters, and be at least 8 characters long. Let's experiment with a password I've actually used. The password looks like this: LeShackZone 82371. Let's try cracking it with the Hashcat tool we looked at earlier. We'll see if such a long and complex password is crackable, or if it does get cracked, how long it takes. All right, I've prepared an incredibly long and complex password. Here's the result after encrypting it with MD5. Let's try cracking it using the password cracking tool called Hashcat, like we did before. With a password that's 19 characters long, the previous method won't work for cracking it. It's too long, and Hashcat might throw an overflow error. In such cases, it's better to try using a method called wordlist. Think of it as a big data collection of passwords that people have actually used. You can easily download this file from security-related websites. However, the file size is quite large for a text file. Now let's take a moment to watch the actual cracking scene. By the way, this password contains no personal information, no phone numbers, and no birthdays. It's a combination of completely unrelated information, which is important. It's like shuffling the letters of two signs you happen to see passing by, or mixing together numbers generated by a random generator. Of course, doing this might be frustrating at first because it's hard to remember. However, if you create several passwords like this and use them regularly, you'll find that it's not as difficult as it seems. Plus, cracking a randomly shuffled complex password without any personal information is practically impossible. It could take decades, even if someone attempts it.